This panel is quite dear to my organization. So as Sandra mentioned, I work at the Center for Countering Digital Hate. We're an international nonprofit that studies disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech. We've had the pleasure of being sued by X for our work documenting the rise of hate speech. We won. Woo! They're appealing, but we won. And so this topic is quite dear to us because as we were talking about transparency and researcher access, it's important that civil society and independent researchers are able to hold these companies accountable. So I'm really excited about our panel here, and I'm going to kick it off right away. Nora, you're an expert on this. So I remember when we were preparing for this panel, you mentioned you wanted to give the audience kind of a timeline of what's happened over the last 8 years. So please situate our audience.
Sure. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I have to say, when we were preparing, we realized we each had about 30 seconds to talk. And so I've narrowed down 400 years of history to 8 years. So it'll be condensed and exciting, just the cliff notes. You know, I guess I'll start, honestly, in a personal way. I've worked as a lawyer for a long time, and the focus has always been how to expand and protect opportunity and access for the most amount of people. And during the advent of the digital age, as more and more people felt like there was opportunity and access with the internet, there also felt like little glimmers of risk. And at first, we didn't know the words for it. And I'm sure Nina can talk a lot about this. But there was something dangerous happening in communities. People didn't know what lies were. They didn't know how to fact check what was really going on in their communities. And over time, there was just an interest in the way that the online world affected the offline world, and making sure that we documented and explained that the online world has offline consequence. I still feel like I am having to do that work every single day. And so first, I honestly want to thank David and All Tech is Human for this type of convening, because the work is an uphill battle in trying to inform how our digital civil rights, how our digital human rights and access are just basic elements. They're table stakes now for living everyday lives. And when it comes to what's happening with social media companies and with tech companies, that's really the heart of all of this. And the way that we each connect with each other has become primarily focused on our phones, on our social media companies, the apps that we use. In about 2016, there was a real lightning rod moment following the US elections. And in particular, various sectors realized that social media was a vector for manipulation and harm that could influence how voters were connecting in the real world. And so, of course, there was government interest, there was researcher interest, there was civil society interest and philanthropic interest, pouring information and energy and money into a field to study and document what was going on with social media platforms. And there have been hiccups and there have been waxing and waning, but more or less a rise in the interest in platform accountability. In the last several years, there has been a very dangerous backslide from that rise in and attention to the way the online world affects the offline world. And so that's really what this panel is here to consider. And I know that the other experts here will talk a lot about their personal experience and what they're working on. I'll just say that this is the kind of moment we're living in where without documentation, without an understanding, without transparency, without groups like the Center for Countering Digital Hate to actually understand and lay bare for the public how that online world shapes what we're thinking about and how we're behaving, it becomes incredibly opaque. And that's when we do not have opportunity and access to live the lives that we want. So I'm excited to talk more in the final minute now that we have.
We can talk about this for hours. Nina, you've been a target of a harassment campaign for your work on disinformation. Could you share with the audience a bit more about that?
Yeah, and I just want to echo Nora's thanks to David and the All Tech is Human team. I think it's an amazing convening here, and to be in this room is just really energizing for me, because this work can be pretty depressing sometimes. So for those that don't know me, I got my start as a Russianist. I studied Russia. I did work supporting Russian opposition groups, Belarusian opposition groups, and then as the first invasion of Ukraine was happening, started looking more at the role of the internet, kind of before all the old white men in Washington realized that it was a vector for Russian influence. And I found myself in Ukraine in 2016 and 2017. What else was happening then? I'm sure we all remember. And started to think about the ways that our allies in Central and Eastern Europe, who had been dealing with disinformation for much longer than we in the West had even recognized that it was a problem, what lessons they could tell us, and came home and started doing work in that area. And in 2022, got asked to lead an entity called the Disinformation Governance Board, which is a terrible name. I did not come up with it, at the Department of Homeland Security. And the idea was that I would be essentially herding cats, that I would be bringing together different parts of DHS. And for those that aren't familiar with DHS, it is a Frankenstein of an agency, all sorts of disparate mission sets and portfolios included therein. And many of them touch disinformation. And the idea was for me to bring them together, to surface best practices, to put some guardrails on the work that DHS was already doing in this space, to make sure that privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties were protected when we were doing that work. And one of the first things I said to my bosses there was, well, it's really important that we talk transparently about what we're doing, because people have some understandable misgivings or hesitancies about the government touching anything to do with speech. And also, people are going to start asking questions about where I've gone, because the war in Ukraine, the second invasion, started a week before I joined DHS, and suddenly I wasn't in the press anymore. And my journalist friends were like, "Where have you gone?" So I thought it was really important that we talk about it, but DHS didn't really think so, and they decided not to issue any sort of release for 8 weeks after I started. And when they did it in a very mealy-mouthed, kind of opaque way. And at that point, Jim Jordan and a couple of other Republican representatives who had already been kind of banging on about so-called government censorship of conservatives recognized an opportunity. And they started talking about the Disinformation Governance Board, which had nothing to do with fact-checking or deciding what was true or false on the internet, as the Ministry of Truth. And I was the truth czar. I was Biden's disinformation czar, which, as a GS-15 in federal government, who, by the way, at the time was about 8 months pregnant, I can tell you, there was no czar in me. It was a miracle if I got out of bed in the morning. But they recognized that opportunity. And so for 3 weeks from when the board was announced on April 27th, 2022, to the day I resigned on May 18th, I was subject to death threats. I was subject to all manner of hateful language. The Federal Protective Service had to get involved. It was a really horrific experience. And again, I was just weeks away from bringing my first child into the world. And there were a couple lessons, I think, a lot of lessons learned. But the biggest was that the Biden administration just kind of flopped over. They were, tapped on the shoulder and immediately gave in to the absolutely baseless attacks on what we were trying to do. And that's ultimately why I resigned. I've written about online abuse. I've studied it. I've experienced it before. Of course, this was bad and mostly buoyed by Fox News. But the kind of crumpling of the administration was the thing that really broke my heart. And it didn't end when I left government, which I think was one of my hopes, that okay, you know what, I'm about to give birth, give them what they want, and I will, move on with my life. Later that year, so around Thanksgiving of 2022, after the election results came in, Jim Jordan made it clear he wanted to subpoena me. I was the first subpoena that he issued under his subcommittee of the weaponization of federal government. I got myself a cyber stalker who then sued me in frivolous civil litigation that cost me tens of thousands of dollars to get dismissed. And ultimately, at the end of 22, I realized, you know what? Fox News is continuing to make a profit lying about me, so I decided to sue them, which a lot of people had cautioned me against, but I felt like they should pay for what they had done to upending my life and my safety, which will never be the same again. I was just telling Nora that my fake Uber name is Nora because I've been in some uncomfortable situations where Uber drivers are listening to conservative talk radio and I'm worried I'm going to get abducted, and that's a real thing in my life. All this to be said, it's not all bad.
It is for me on Uber.
As Suzi mentioned, I started a new nonprofit this year called the American Sunlight Project. And basically I came to the realization at the beginning of the year, like, I've been through some shit. And if I've had to go through it, I might as well use this relative, I wouldn't say immunity, but I'm hard now, right? And I'm going to put up my hand and thank you for better or for worse. I talk to my therapist a lot about that. But I think we can provide some political cover for organizations that are facing some threats now. And so we're in the political arena. We like to say that we're exposing and educating people about deceptive information practices. And one of the ways that we've done this, and I promise I'm wrapping up now, is by sending cease and desist letters to people like Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, who have been defaming and talking about our industry and this group of people that is gathered here today as censors, which we all know we are not. I'm happy to say when we sent those cease and desist letters, both of them crumpled immediately. So my message is that we shouldn't be afraid of fighting back. And for the philanthropists, the donors, the people who have the honor of supporting researchers and folks in this sector, please have our backs when we do stuff like this, because it's the institutions and the lack of institutional support that I think has led to a lot of the dominoes that we've seen falling in this space lately.
Well said. CCDH, as I mentioned, had been sued, but other nonprofits that were sued have not been as lucky as we are. I mean, we also got sued in California. We got a great judge, but others aren't. So we do have to fight back, but it's not very easy. And that segues onto over the legal frameworks. In what ways, Alex, do you believe that the current legal frameworks either hinder or support transparency efforts, researcher access?
Yeah, great question. Delighted to be here. I also use Nora as my fake Uber name. But it's great
really
to be here.
Falling fast.
Yeah. It's great to be here for this event and with All Tech is Human. And I will say that walking up on the stage in the way that we did is the closest I felt to being on The Price is Right, which was a dream of mine growing up. So I work at a First Amendment Institute, and we got interested in this area about 7 years ago when a reporter came into our offices and said that he had proposed a way of studying the spread of misinformation on Facebook at the time to the legal team at the news organization that he was working for, and the legal team said, no, the legal risks to you running this experiment are too great because the risk, the tool that he wanted to use to study Facebook involved what Facebook would have argued at the time and still argues today, a violation of the company's terms of service, which prohibit the automated collection of public information from their sites. And so we have spent the last 7 years trying to understand the ways in which law has been mobilized against efforts to understand platforms and other systems that embed technological tools whose operation is largely opaque to the public and even to many of the platforms that embed these tools. And I think it's great that this panel follows on the heels of the last one, because that form of feedback, that mechanism for understanding our digital environment is very much a crucial part of any functioning system of governance, because you need rules that apply from the top down. You need mechanisms for grading these systems from standards bodies and within the companies themselves, but you also need an outside check. You need independent researchers who are able to tell not just whether the restaurant passes its health inspection, but who can go there on a random Tuesday night and see whether there are rats running around the floor and they didn't just clean up on Sunday when the inspector came. So that's the work that, some of the work that we've been doing at the Institute for the last 7 years is trying to understand these threats. And these threats come in a variety of different flavors. And I thought I would just give you a sense of them so you know what we're up against. The most direct threat are direct lawsuits, as Suzi was mentioning. And the lawsuits take a couple of different forms, but many of them, especially for the early years, although they have started to change over the last several, took the form of alleging or more commonly threatening in cease and desist letters enforcement of companies' terms of service against research, even when that research was privacy preserving and was in the public interest because it would expose the way that these platforms work. The journalist who came into our office was just one of those many, but one of the ones that we got involved in involved researchers at NYU who were pursuing IRB approved research into the flow of misinformation through Facebook's system for selling political advertisements. And Facebook sent a nasty cease and desist letter to them. They retained outside counsel. They had their inside counsel, the general counsel's office in NYU. And we spent I don't know, maybe 2 years negotiating with Facebook over the legal threat that they had issued, ultimately reached a bit of a detente, fortunately, but there is still a lack of legal certainty about whether researchers who violate terms of service or allegedly violate terms of service in the service of this research should fear legal liability. And we used to be able to say to most researchers who came into our offices that at least fortunately, you're unlikely to be sued because most of the platforms know that they don't want to see the New York Times or NYU or some other reputable nonprofit studying them in the news, decrying these efforts to shut down their research. But then leadership at Twitter changed, became X, and X filed, at least to my knowledge, the first lawsuit against bona fide research on the social media platforms, alleging that the Center for Countering Digital Hate had violated X's terms of service by collecting, using software, about, I think, 9,000 tweets, posts, I don't know what they call them now, tweets from the platform to study the prevalence of hate and disinformation. So that's one flavor of the legal threat that we see. We are also seeing, as Nina mentioned, the recharacterization of what is, in fact, constitutionally protected research by private researchers on these public platforms as a form of censorship. The argument that all of these researchers are in cahoots with the government, and even when they are not, they are engaged in a censorship industrial complex, which is the term that the Jim Jordan Committee has used to describe this entire field of study. And that has been enormously onerous for the researchers engaged in this work because many of them have been hauled before Congress, often in interviews that are never reported on to the public but take place behind closed doors where they are subjected to hours and hours of grueling questioning and then followed up or led up to by extremely burdensome subpoenas demanding that they and the research institutions turn over all manner of information about, again, constitutionally protected research on the platforms in the vain hope of uncovering a smoking gun that doesn't exist, demonstrating a connection between these private researchers and government. And that has had an enormous chilling effect that has been palpable, at least in the dozens of conversations we've now had with researchers around the country who have to worry about a complex relationship they may have with their research institution that for political reasons may fight behind closed doors, but not once the fight becomes public. And these have been very challenging times for the researchers. So just quickly, there are the congressional investigations that are also going on. It's not just the Jordan Committee. There are other committees in Congress. There are state attorney general investigations taking place in Texas and Missouri that involve many of the same tactics of investigating constitutionally protected research, sending broad and onerous subpoenas. We also see the use of state transparency laws, freedom of information laws, being used to target public university researchers in particular. And this, unfortunately, is not a new tactic. This has, taken place for decades. It used to be around climate research or research relating to reproductive health, and now, the politicized issue of the day is platform research. And you have a lot of private organizations submitting these public records requests to these public universities, and researchers spending hours and hours responding to them, often having to reveal sensitive internal correspondence. And underlying all of this, what I think of as a legal threat, but in reality is just an enormous failure in industry, is just a lack of data access. And the reason why researchers have to engage in this form of self-help where they're studying the platforms using tools to scrape their publicly accessible sites is because they just don't have access to the data because, as Nora said, there's been a massive retrenchment over the last few years. Some platforms used to offer some tools to study their services, fewer than did, and now the ones that did have by and large pulled back, making it very difficult for researchers to figure out what's going on in the platforms. X pulled back its API. They made it exorbitantly expensive, so effectively inaccessible to researchers. CrowdTangle, which was the tool that many journalists and researchers used to study Facebook, no longer exists and has been replaced by a different tool that most researchers say is inadequate. So the landscape looks bleak when it comes to independent research on the platforms, which is why there are a lot of efforts in Congress, in the advocacy community, and through donors who are supporting this research to try to push back. But that's the current state of affairs. I'm not optimistic about it, but I'm hoping things are taking a turn.
Yeah, I mean, it's just been awful. And you mentioned like all the tools being rolled back. The other one too, just like a more subtle one, is like TikTok used to have its creator center, which was really good, which was meant for creators to like obviously put content on a platform, but it was also used by a lot of researchers to kind of understand like which trends and hashtags are popular on the platform, and they removed that. So I found that quite interesting because it's like you removed it even for your content creators because that's how afraid you are of transparency.
Even Reddit has shut down its API, and we all know there's a lot of nasty things on Reddit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've been in so many calls with all of you, and something that always comes up, my favorite topic, is the intersection between privacy and transparency. So I would love to hear from each of you on your views on that, and just like kind of lay out for the audience like why there may or may not be tension in that regards.
I'm looking at the lawyers because I feel like I shouldn't wade into this one.
I'm happy to kick us off. It is an enormously important question to figure out how to provide the transparency you need while respecting user privacy. I guess I'll say a couple of things. One is that this is not a new problem, and it has taken on a new urgency because of the scale of data that these platforms have about people, particularly when it comes to AI models that are trained on enormous corpuses of information. But we have models that are worth studying for what they can help us, understand about how to balance or trade off, these two important values in any democratic society. And the models that I would look to are the ones from the life sciences. We have a privacy law in medical research that balances the interests that patients have in the privacy of their medical records with the needs of medical researchers to be able to access some of that information to help diagnostics and the like. The law is called HIPAA. I can never get the acronym right, but the Health Information and Patient Portability Act or something like that. And it is it has a complex set of trade-offs between these two important societal values. The other has to do with clinical trial data, which is subject to its own set of regulations. But again, enormously sensitive information about people and their medical decisions repurposed in a way that is nominally, hopefully respectful of medical privacy to enable research. And I think we can come up with a similar system that reflects those trade-offs. And we have actually at the Knight Institute made one proposal in this direction. We made a proposal like this to Facebook, and we negotiated with Facebook over it for 18 months. We proposed that they include a safe harbor in their terms of service for privacy-preserving research. And we came up with a draft of what that kind of amendment to the terms of service might look like as a proof of concept. We spent about 18 months sporadically negotiating with the company over this proposal. At the end of the day, they said in our meetings that they would never publicly say that scraping is okay, and they wanted all research on the platform to take place through, and the term they used over and over in our negotiations was individually managed relationships, which is in many ways just fundamentally inconsistent with independent research. We converted that into a legislative version to force them to do this, and that ended up making its way into the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which I'm not holding my breath for being enacted, but there are models out there for doing this.
Now Nina's excited. Can you all hear me? I feel like my mic is maybe less powerful. Here we go. Okay. No, it's okay. We'll try. Okay. Let's do it. Okay. Is it this? Yeah. See? Okay. It's interesting. I would challenge all of us to make transparency compelling, make it sexy, because it really never sounds it. But in any other context, when we get out of the tech world, transparency is key to public trust and to good governance. In the business and human rights fields, in democracy studies, there are such strong corollaries between robust public engagement and transparency metrics. Whether that is reporting that local governments do so that the public understands where dollars go, whether it's how business standards are developed and how corporations adhere to those. And so there's this odd sort of bubble that the tech industry has been able to live within and get away with a kind of protection to say, well, we exist in this little bubble and we do not need to adhere to the transparency and best practices where disclosures help advance and safeguard public trust. And so I would, one, invite and challenge all of you to take up that task in conversation. That's one of the most baseline things we can all do. There are amazing legislative and regulatory efforts now underway, many of which I hope will begin to correct and build up the backbone and the courage that our regulatory scheme did not show to Nina and to others, given what Nina's story has shown us. And I just want to sort of, I guess, reflect on what lack of transparency really does to us, what the impact is, because we haven't actually dealt with that here in this conversation. And unfortunately, Suzi is in the elegant moderator role and so cannot, dare I say, testify as much to what her organization has gone through. But the Center for Countering Digital Hate is a very close colleague of mine at Free Press, and we worked closely together documenting and putting pressure on companies like Twitter, now X, to increase and bolster trust and safety standards after Elon Musk took over. And of course, as so many of us know, he systematically undid almost all of those that had already been in place and then took more proactive measures to continue to erode platform integrity. It's a big term, but it is the ability for people to go to a platform and to feel like there is a sense of integrity to information that's on that platform. And in the face of the research that CCDH put out, basically just putting a mirror up to Elon Musk and his performance, his solution and his answer was to sue them. And his solution since has been to go after others who seek to lay bare and document what is happening online and specifically on X. The solution to muzzle transparency, to muzzle public inquiry into a field that affects all of us is a very dangerous precedent. And it's really just one piece, as you've heard now from Nina and from the rest of Alex's comments, an entire field that is subject to the whims of a small, select set of special interests. And as we see the winnowing of access, the winnowing of public information, that affects public trust. It affects our ability to make sense of the world and ourselves. And so in the middle of the very tremendous and brilliant, by the way, Alex and I have known each other for years, and he's an all-star in this field, and just it's amazing to be on stage with him. The work that he and the Knight Institute have done to develop even model and early nascent language around how we hold platforms accountable in a transparency sense, that's tremendous. We have to, all of us then take up that task, I think, and we have to understand that the absence of transparency ultimately affects all of us.
Well, I don't think I can be as stirring as Nora just was about transparency.
It's 'cause the mic works.
But I will say, just kind of remembering early days of conversations about this, I was at one event back before the launch of the Social Science Research Council kind of thing with Facebook, where they were allowing access to researchers, certain researchers, to data. And I remember the conversation back then was that if you got admitted to this, you would have your Facebook issued laptop, and that was the only thing that you were able to access the data on. I never was in the echelon of people who was even considered for that. But I mean, that's an individually managed relationship, right? And it's just so insane to me that we're allowing the platforms to basically do that, whether it's via a Facebook issued laptop or via the new content center that we're all slowly getting access to. I think there needs to be a clearinghouse for this information that the federal government hosts. That we have it with the FEC, right? We have ads that are tracked. We have campaign donations that are tracked. It's not a perfect model, but we have it for other regulatory schemes. And the fact that we have not set one up, and we're in the year of elections, the year of AI elections. We have no rules around AI. We have no rules around platform transparency. It's just a shocking dereliction of duty from a Congress that claims to care about transparency and the way that individuals or entities are interacting with social media platforms. I mean, the intellectual dishonesty is shocking. But I think there's ways to do all of this, and GDPR has provided a pretty good model. I mean, it's not perfect, but research studies that I've done since GDPR has come out out. We've instituted those standards on ourselves. We've anonymized the data and pseudonymized the data and made sure it gets deleted after a certain amount of time. And I'm sure CCDH does the same, being in the UK, right? So I think there is a way forward, and it's on all of us to not only pressure the powers that be, but to put forward the sort of transparency that we want to see, transparency and privacy that we want to see in our research.
Yeah, of course. I think Bob said this in their opening remarks, but it was something touching on like how the technology is old, and in a way, like these problems like may seem novel, but it's the same strategic, same tactics, same FOIA requests that used to go after university surface for. So it hasn't really changed. And thank you so much, all of you, for like bringing this to surface. And can we just give them a round of applause for their amazing work?